Alleluia. Om Mani Padme Om. Allah Satnam.
Welcome. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and we're speaking again to Dr Mick Pope. He's a meteorologist and an eco theologian, and we're discussing the book that he's written called A Climate of Hope. Last week we spoke about the religious Christian perspective of it, and today we'd like to examine what are the scientific elements. Thanks again, Mick.
Pleasure.
There are some pretty strange stories, or fearsome stories actually, come about from the climate change. Have you got a few of those that you could run through for us?
Well, the first thing is to differentiate between weather and climate. So it's pretty cliched, but weather's what you get and climate is what you expect.
Okay.
And what we're starting to see is that the expectation is changing, so that what we get is changing. There's a quote in the book from a climatologist Kevin Trenberth, an American, and I think it's worth reading. The answer to the oft-asked question of whether an event is caused by climate change is that it is the wrong question. All weather events are affected by climate change because the environment in which they occur is warmer and moister than it used to be. So it's a bit like at one time we were playing with an ordinary deck, and now the deck's it's got extra aces.
Stacked, yeah.
The deck is stacked. The dice are now loaded, so that it's important to look at long-term changes. And of course, we have long-term records of temperature, for example, that show the past. Most of the hottest years on record occurred in the 21st century. I mean, 2014 was the hottest year on record, and even though the past month has been relatively mild, the 12-month period is still well and truly above average, and that impacts in various ways. So Arctic sea ice is at an all-time low, and people will then respond and say, well, hang on, it will jump from year to year and you'll get this dramatic recovery. That's masking the fact that the aerial extent is not the most significant thing, it's the volume of ice.
That's right.
And the ice is thinner than it's ever been, the distribution of thickness. So the thinnest ice is the most recent freeze, and the thickest ice is the oldest ice. But as the ice gets thinner and thinner, you can get very dramatic changes in the short term in terms of the volume, but it continues to go into decline. We've seen in Australia, for example, that we've had to extend the fire season.
Yes.
So the length of time that meteorologists man the severe weather desk, or person the severe weather desk, if you will, because there are lots of female meteorologists, that it's got longer, and we had to introduce a new category of severity for fire weather, and that's again perfectly consistent with a warming planet. You've got things like the Carteret Islanders off Papua New Guinea having to evacuate their islands because sea level is slowly rising, and we have to remember that it's not simply the impact of the sea level rise, but what happens when there's a tropical storm, when there's a very high tide, a king tide, and the impact that erosion can have. And remember that the projections are talking about 0.5 metre to 1 metre, which are conservative, very conservative in fact, and most of Australia, all their capital cities bar Canberra, are right near the beach, they're right near sea level. And then you've got things like disease, for example, in many parts in the tropics, where malaria and dengue fever are spreading to new areas never been before, particularly at higher elevations.
Yes.
Malaria means literally bad air, and so that comes from the time when malaria was rife through Rome, Roman capital, in times of Jesus. So settlers used to know that you'd go to the highlands in places like Ethiopia and Kenya and so on to escape the mosquitoes, but now the mosquitoes ranges are spreading. So there's just a few, and then there's things like coral bleaching, for example, and there's still debate precisely on how much of a coral will survive a warming planet, but we're set to lose most of it, and we can see from year to year how the Great Barrier Reef, for example, is stressed. And that's not just a matter of tourism. If I live in the Pacific, where does most of my protein come from? If from the fish that live in the coral reef.
Yes.
So, I mean, you can name anything that you like. Another example would be the wonky winters that they've had in North America. The jet stream, because the Arctic has warmed, the jet stream has become weaker and wobbled about. And that's had impact upon their winter season. The winter time has become colder at times because of this.
There's also that, and the name escapes me, but that deep set current which runs around the ocean up north and down the coast of America.
The Gulf Stream.
Gulf Stream, that's the one. That's changing apparently. That's changing
It's not my area of expertise, oceanography, and one of the things we need to be careful about is the ocean does vary on timescale. I mean, it's one of the longer term threats that, in fact, kind of paradoxically, you'll get lots of meltwater and that will slow it down.
Yes.
Not the day after tomorrow type dramatic, but nonetheless, warming the planet affects a whole suite of things. And then we forget, for example, that some of the carbon dioxide is absorbed by the oceans. The oceans become more acidic, which makes it for a very hard time for a lot of marine life.
Certainly does. Now, a car hits a wall. It's not the car's fault, it's the driver's fault. What are the drivers in this? Because it's not just happening, it's happening for reasons.
Well, it certainly is. And the two main drivers are the burning of fossil fuels and the clearing of vegetation.
Right.
So where the fossil fuel, as the name suggests, is dead organic matter that's been buried for a long, long time and undergone various reactions to build very complex long chains. And petroleum being one is amazingly efficient in terms of the energy that it produces, which is why we've used it so much, because it's delivered so many positives in terms of travel and so on. But it releases that carbon that was stored in the atmosphere, that was stored in the fossil fuels back into the atmosphere.
Yes.
And when it was being stored, the planet was a great deal warmer, but there were no human beings about. So now we're driving the climate by producing more of these fossil fuels. It's like putting more and more blankets on your bed.
Yeah.
It's retaining more and more heat, and it's warming the oceans as well, which gives rise to sea level rise. But also when you clear more and more land for agriculture and building cities and so on, you lose that capacity for the land to store the carbon. So trees, yes, they do like carbon dioxide, but not as much as we're putting into the atmosphere.
That's right. Yes, and of course the whole issue of trees comes down to wood, and that's not just used for building, it's used for very expensive pieces of furniture, and often you'll look at something, you'll see a beautiful table and you say, well, I wonder what forest illegally cut tree made that. But after that deep point of philosophy, we're out of time. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and we're speaking with Dr Mick Pope. He's a meteorologist and an eco theologian. And we're talking about climate change in detail. The first part, we were talking about the sorts of things that are happening, indicating climate change. And during that conversation, Mick mentioned an acronym IPAT. Can you explain a bit more about that?
Sure. When we think about our impact upon the world around us, it's a function of three things. The first is population.
Yep.
And theologically, God blesses us to be fruitful and to multiply, and we've certainly done that. And so the more people that you have on the planet, the more resources you need. And cities in particular are very resource rich, or rather resource needy. So large populations can have very large impacts. But if you think about the Australian impact, particularly on climate change versus those of India or someone in the Southwest Pacific, there's another factor. And it turns out, according to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it's the chief driver now in the West, and that's affluence. Right. So it's the lifestyle. How many cars do you have? How much meat do you consume? My wife's just gone vegan past few months, and so we've largely followed suit. There are some debates about that, but by and large eating less meat means less greenhouse gases. And then there's levels of technology, which can be a plus and a minus when you think about it. If we had entirely renewable energy, then technology would be a plus, but if you're replacing your iPhone or whatever mobile phone you use every couple of years we become incredibly reliant upon technology, and greenhouse gases are involved in their production and so on. So there are these three factors and they come together, and affluence is the key these days. Another way of looking at it is to think about the way in which the economy runs. So there's this picture that there are three interlocking circles that join together. The first is the economy. It's not really the first, but it's the one we hear about the most in the news. You've got human society and the relationships that we have, and what's the whole point of being human. And of course Christianity and other religions address the meaning of that. And you could also talk about that in terms of natural capital. Human capital. And then you've got natural capital, which is the natural world and the resources that it has and the creatures that exist for their own sake, etc., etc. And if the economy is properly contained and considers those other two, then we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in. Some wit has come up with the idea of the Mickey Mouse economy. So instead of three equal circles, or whatever the appropriate size is for those, the economy becomes huge, and so the human capital and the natural capital become these small bits on top, like Mickey Mouse's ears.
Yeah. Yes.
Rather than thinking about the following, why do we have an economy in the first place? It's the exchange of goods and services so that people might pursue the good life. And so you've got the economy should sit inside human society, which then sits inside the limits of the natural world around us. And if you like, I think about the underlying narratives which drive this sort of thing. Look at Genesis chapter 3, it's the grasping after the fruit. We've gone beyond the boundaries that were set for us. Yes. And so we're the same sorts of things that deny people the right to sit at home on a Sunday, or if they have to work on a Sunday, penalty rates, is the same sorts of greed and idolatry that drives environmental change.
Yes.
What's good for the planet's what's good for human beings, and vice versa. Ultimate good,
yes.
And that's loving God, loving your neighbour, loving the creation that He's made. And so I think that when the narrative's out of shape, it's not a narrative of love, then you end up with, well, apologies to Walt Disney, a Mickey Mouse economy, a Mickey Mouse world, and that's perfectly appropriate given how effective Disney are at corporatising things. We live in a Mick world, and we're reaping the consequences of that.
Yeah, I think from a Jesus point of view, would anything about the issue of the sparrows in the field, does that move into this where a lot of this is driven by fear of lack of providence? Perhaps a readdressing the issue of providence?
Certainly, I think, and that goes right back to the Old Testament and the idea of the manna in the wilderness, don't collect on the Sabbath, the idea of Sabbath rest and the year of Jubilee, that things are set up so that we can acquire enough for our needs, not necessarily for our wants. And once you push beyond that and don't trust God's providence, then things will go wrong. And the whole issue, Jesus saying with the sparrows and the lilies, that human beings are more important than the sparrows. The sparrows are obviously also important because God knows when they fall. So we need to think very carefully about the value that we place on things. So if we place too much value on the clothes that we wear or the way in which the economy is run and making a profit and never resting, Citibank saying that it never sleeps, it never rests, and that's the way the economy is these days. Again, not to pick on them in particular. So yeah, there's a time for rest. There's a Sabbath rest. There's sleeping at night. There's which electric lights have messed with. It's just there's a certain restlessness.
Yes.
That global theo-capitalism, as Brian McLaren describes it, produces in us through advertising and the need for more and more all the time. And St. Augustine says that our restlessness doesn't find its end until it's in God, resting in God.
Yes. The iPad concept, are you familiar with any ways in which there's emphasis, be like population management, the limiting of population? How is that being managed? Is there a big effort in relation to that?
Well, you have, there's a group in Australia that are very keen on zero population growth, and there's certainly, for all the space that we have a fairly low carrying capacity because most of Australia is arid. In China, you get something that's very draconian. Certainly in the West, you see that population growth's in decline. And the other thing that you see in the so-called developing world, if you educate women, sooner or later the birth rate will decline.
Yes.
Beyond that, there is no ethical way of reducing population fast enough to deal with the problem of climate change.
Right.
No humane, Christian, ethical way of doing that. So we have to deal with the affluence and technology. So renewable energy and understanding that the good life doesn't rely upon the abundance of your possessions.
Right.
That's the place to hit it.
But it does rely on the abundance of time, and we're out of that. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and we're speaking with Dr Mick Pope. He's a meteorologist and an eco theologian, and we're talking about the book A Climate of Hope, which was written by himself and Claire Dawson. At the moment we're concentrating on the climate change part of the book, and that's, at this point, technology. What sort of technological impacts? So we've got IPAT, and if you just run through what IPAT stands for again, it stands for impact, population, affluence and technology. Yeah, they're supposed to make them easier to remember. I'm not doing so well. Technology. What's the key areas for the impact from technology?
Well, there's a couple, I suppose, and there's the technology of anything that requires fossil fuels. Yeah. So it's electricity and it's transportation and whatever else, and that's been one of the key drivers, obviously, of climate change, and it's forced by the level of affluence that you have in the population. So how many people do you have who need to live a basic lifestyle and use energy? Everything uses energy. Plants use energy from the sun, human beings use energy from food, and the modern industrial society uses energy from fossil fuels. So when we come to think about what's going to be part of the solution, technology is going to play a key role, but we need to be very savvy about this, precisely because if we don't change our attitude, technology will not save us. Yep. If we could, just take a couple of angles on that. Firstly, if you could produce energy for essentially nothing, from nothing, and could have as much stuff as you liked, would you? And would it make you any happier? And research has shown, for example, with incomes, that it kind of peaks at a certain income, that it doesn't make you any happier. So why keep pursuing more and more stuff? Is there some kind of, well, what's the level of you're happy enough, you don't need any more? So when we think about renewable energy sources, we still have to think about efficiency and how much we need and how much we want. If we drive things too far, people are proposing ways of engineering the entire climate by putting up mirrors in space, for example, to reflect back sunlight, or filling the upper atmosphere with aerosols to reflect sunlight, or capturing the carbon dioxide that we've already emitted. And there's various schemes and they have their various merits, but in the end, firstly, I think they stand on shaky ground. We don't know the full impacts of what they'll have. But also it misses the point that you're looking to technology as a saviour. Yeah. And it makes me think of the story of the prophets of Baal and Elijah on Mount Carmel. The drought's been caused by our idolatry, so we're going to pray to Baal to end the drought, which our idolatry caused in the first place. It's a form of idolatry to say, well, we live a particular lifestyle, it's very comfortable, we've relied upon fossil fuels, let's just turn to technology to undo the damage. Yeah. No, it has to be accompanied by, what does it mean to be human? What is the good life? And then we need renewable energy. So, and we really need a target. I mean, I don't know how you solve the problem of global warming, of climate change, without saying, by this date we'll have this much solar and wind, by this date we'll have this technology, we might have nuclear in the mix. I know people have various attitudes towards that, and so on, but a definite plan for phasing out fossil fuels. So technology is that two-edged sword. It's got us into the problem, but it's more than the technology, it's the attitudes behind it, the level of affluence we've pursued, and so on. Technology will be part of the solution, but what kind of technologies will we pursue, and how will that reflect our hearts?
That's right. And I'm watching in my mind's eye, the Mickey Mouse example that you gave growing bigger and bigger, because the technological part comes out of the economy part, because no one's going to do it unless it gives them a profit. They're not going to lose. So that the years are going to get smaller, and the economic part is going to get bigger and bigger. So that you sequestering carbon dioxide in the ground or wherever they're going to do it, that's a technological problem, isn't it? How are they going to pump it there? Is there a huge amount of machinery involved there?
Well, it's the thing that people have hung their hat on, and there's been a number of years of funding, and not there's a few issues with that. The best way to do it, obviously, is to capture it before it makes it into the atmosphere. And people have said, for example, you've got an oil field, and the thing with oil fields is as you extract more and more oil, the pressure goes down and becomes more difficult to extract it. So if you pump carbon dioxide down into the bedrock and it drives out the oil, you kill two birds with one stone. You get more fossil fuels, which is a bad thing. but you store the carbon dioxide, and not every site is suitable for that. But the other thing is, there was actually a project that did that in the United States. I think it was a coal-fired power station, but because there was no carbon market, they stopped funding the project.
That's it.
So you need a carbon market, you need a carbon tax, you need renewable energy targets, you need all these policy mechanisms in place that make it easy to pursue these things.
Yeah, Mick, this is very complex as we go through this. I think you've got a website. I think it's climateofchange.com.
Climateofhope.com.
Climateofhope.com. Yes, see, climate change has got me. Climateofhope.com.
Yep.
Now, the book itself doesn't come out until March, is that right?
We're launching on the 21st of March.
21st of March.
And then there'll be information about where it's available on the website, through Christian bookshops, through UNO's site, and through places like Amazon.
And you'll also have some references there for places people can go to get more data.
We've got web links and so on.
Yeah, terrific. Just coming back to a key point of this, which is human behaviour, and that's affluence. From a Christian context, there's quite some indicators about affluence or avoidance of it, which comes out of Jesus' words, aren't there?
There's the whole issue of not worshipping mammon, not worshipping money. The early church was very much shaped about sharing goods in common and caring for those in need. Of course, the teaching, the parable of the Good Samaritan encapsulates that in great detail, in that you don't limit that to, there's the expression that charity begins at home, but it certainly doesn't end there.
No.
And so I think the church should be taking the lead in sacrificial generosity, and seeing that in the future the life that we lead will look very different to the life that we have now. And think about how it is that we follow the good life. I'm not talking about masochism or suffering for its own sake, but being sacrificial so that others can live a quality life as well.
Yes. So would that be your solution? Would be for the church to focus on that? Now, I'll tell you what I'm doing here, because we've got a little clock here and I'm looking at, you're not going to be able to answer this. So what I'll do is I'll thank you very much for your time, and you've already agreed to the fact that maybe you could come back at some later stage and with Claire Dawson, and we can go through it from a dual point of view.
That would be wonderful, yeah.
Thank you very much, Mick. You've been watching Harmony and Diversity. We'll be back again next week. Bye for now.
Baha'u'llah, Shanti Om.